After the recovery at the Anadarko site, there was no space left for hope, and no space left for a misunderstanding. The case moved from the emotional language of a disappearance into the hard language of documentation. Because once bodies are found, every hour has to be accounted for, and every decision has to be preserved in a form that can stand up in court. The way the bodies were found mattered, not only because it was horrifying, but because it proved intent. Shanann was located in a shallow grave near an oil storage facility. Bella and Celeste were located inside crude oil tanks. Each child was placed into a different tank, and each tank had an opening described as only 8 inches in diameter. The medical examiner later noted injuries consistent with being forced through that opening, and a tuft of blonde hair was found at the edge of one hatch. These details are difficult to hear, but they exist in the public record for a reason. They show that the disposal was not accidental and not improvised in a moment of panic. It was a method of concealment chosen with full awareness of what it would require. And the location mattered. It was not random ground. It was connected to Watts's employment. It was a place he knew, a place he could enter without attracting attention, a place that allowed him to move between normal routine and hidden violence. In many crimes, concealment is a separate act that reveals as much about the perpetrator as the murder itself. In this case, concealment became part of the story because it was carried out in a setting that felt industrial and remote, the opposite of the suburban home where the public first saw his face. Once investigators had recoveries and a confession, the legal structure moved quickly. Charges were filed that reflected each loss as its own crime. The state treated the deaths of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste as separate first-degree murder counts, with additional counts tied to the children being under 12 and Watts being in a position of trust. The pregnancy was also recognized legally through the charge of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and the concealment was recognized through multiple counts of tampering with a deceased human body. That structure is how the legal system tells the truth in its own language. It separates harm into counts so that nothing is blurred, nothing is absorbed into a single headline, and nothing is lost in a general phrase like family tragedy. From the outside, people often assume that the most important part of a case is the motive. From the inside, the most important part is proof. Motive helps explain. Proof is what convicts. In the Watts case, proof accumulated fast because the timeline was tight and the investigation began early. A friend raised concern the same day Shanann returned home. Police entered the home that afternoon. The house contained too many essential items left behind. Federal and state agencies joined quickly. Watts spoke publicly, then faced a polygraph, failed it, and began to confess. But confession did not arrive cleanly, and that matters. Watts did not initially present himself as the person who killed his entire family. He admitted to killing Shanann, but he falsely claimed he did so only because Shanann had smothered the girls first. That lie was not a detail. It was a strategy. It was an attempt to shift the children's deaths onto the victim and to reduce his own role to the language of reaction. It was also an attempt to control the story in the one way he still could, by deciding which truth he would admit and which truth he would hide. Investigators did not treat that first version as closure. They treated it as a step. Because a confession can be both true and false at the same time. It can tell you where bodies are while lying about why bodies are there. It can admit one act while hiding another. It can be shaped to reduce blame, to preserve an image, or simply to avoid speaking the full reality out loud. The legal resolution came through a plea deal, and the plea deal carried one of the most revealing details of the case. The death penalty was not pursued by the Weld County District Attorney at the request of Shanann's family, who did not wish for any further deaths. They supported the decision to accept the plea deal. This is where the case becomes not only about what the state can do, but about what a family wants to live through. A death penalty prosecution can stretch for years. It can keep the perpetrator at the center of attention through hearings, appeals, and delays. It can force families to revisit the worst details over and over. A plea deal can end the public process quickly and deliver finality, even if finality never feels like justice in the emotional sense. On November 6, 2018, Watts pleaded guilty to the murders and related counts. On November 19th, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, with 3 life sentences served consecutively and 2 served concurrently, plus additional years for unlawful termination of the pregnancy and for tampering with the deceased body. It was a sentence structured to be permanent. There is also a quiet historical detail in that timeline. The plea deal removed the death penalty from sentencing, and Colorado would later abolish the death penalty in 2020. That fact does not change the case, but it frames it. The Watts case sits on the edge of a shift in how the state handles its most extreme crimes, and the plea deal arrived before that legal shift became law. After sentencing, the system still had to deal with the reality of notoriety. High-profile inmates create risks. They draw threats. They can become targets. They can require protective measures that affect the prison environment. In early December of 2018, Watts was moved to an out-of-state location due to security concerns, and he was transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security prison. For the public, that transfer felt like the end. The story looked complete. The killer was convicted. The sentence was final. The door was closed. But for investigators, the story still had missing pieces. Because a plea deal can end the courtroom narrative without answering every question about sequence, intent, and motive. And for the people who follow cases like this, the unanswered questions are often the ones that keep the case alive in the mind. People want to know how it happened in detail, not to glorify it, but to understand whether there were warning signs, whether it was planned, whether it could have been prevented, and whether the first confession was a lie designed to protect the perpetrator's image. That is why, months later, the case continued through a follow-up interview. On February 18, 2019, investigators visited Watts in Wisconsin. Agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a Frederick police detective conducted a follow-up interview with him at the correctional institution. The report of that interview was later released publicly in early March. The purpose of a follow-up interview after a guilty plea is not to prove guilt again. Guilt is already fixed. The purpose is to document a complete account, to resolve contradictions, and to understand the offender's story well enough to compare it against evidence, because even after a plea, the system needs clarity for the record. This is the point where the case becomes even more unsettling, because the record indicates that months after his arrest, Watts admitted that he also murdered his children. That admission matters because it collapses his original attempt to shift blame. It removes the final barrier between the public and the simplest truth of the case, that the person who stood outside his home and pleaded for his family's return was also the person who ended their lives. And it forces one more recognition. The earliest story he told was not simply incomplete. It was structured. It was designed to place the most unforgivable act onto someone who could not defend herself. It was designed to preserve a version of himself that could survive public judgment. Even after the bodies were found, even after the confession began, he still tried to manage how the world would view him. That is why the Watts case continues to disturb people years later. It is not only the murders. It is the staging of innocence. It is the way normal language was used as a shield. It is the way an ordinary suburban setting became the front end of an industrial disposal site. It is the way a husband and father could move through his day, go to work, answer calls, and speak to the media, while the family he claimed to love was already gone. In the end, the record is clear about the legal outcome, but the human meaning remains hard to hold. The motive in the public summary is resentment and infidelity. Those words are common. Many marriages carry resentment. Many marriages face infidelity. Most do not end in annihilation. The Watts case forces the question of how a person turns ordinary failure into extraordinary violence, and how a person convinces himself that erasing his family is easier than facing divorce, responsibility, and consequences. The follow-up interview exists because investigators wanted the fullest possible answer to that question, not because it excuses anything, and not because it changes the sentence, but because a complete record is one of the few forms of accountability left after a plea. A plea ends the fight in court. It does not end the need to understand what happened, or how the perpetrator tried to rewrite it, or how close the case came to being hidden behind ordinary routines. And that is where the story sits now, locked legally, but still alive in public memory. A case that began with a friend knocking on a door and hearing nothing. A case that moved into a public plea outside a quiet home. A case that ended in a remote oil field and a permanent sentence. And a case that continued months later in a prison interview room where the questions were no longer about where they were, but about what he was willing to admit and what the record would ultimately reveal. Months after the plea and the life sentences, investigators went back to Christopher Watts in prison for a reason that has nothing to do with reopening the case. The purpose was to finish the record. A guilty plea ends the legal fight, but it does not automatically answer every question about sequence, motive, and preparation. It also does not erase the fact that the first story he told was designed to redirect blame. So, in February of 2019, agents and a detective met with him in Wisconsin and asked him to walk back through the path that led to the murders, not as a public performance, but as a detailed account to be preserved. The setting for that follow-up was almost mundane. It was a large open room inside the prison that staff referred to as the computer room, with empty cubicles along the walls. The investigators told him they were not there to discuss an open investigation. They told him they wanted to understand what happened. That framing matters because it shifts the conversation away from the tactics of arrest and toward the psychology of explanation. It also removes the most common excuse a killer uses during questioning, which is fear of legal consequences, because the consequences were already permanent. He described prison life as easier than the county jail in Colorado, because in the jail he could hear other inmates yelling threats and telling him to kill himself. He described receiving letters from strangers, some condemning him, some trying to reach him. This detail is not important because it creates sympathy. It is important because it shows how quickly his identity stopped being a private identity and became a public object. He was no longer simply a man serving a sentence. He was an infamous story that people wrote to, argued about, and projected onto. Then the conversation returned to the months before August 13th, because the months before the murders are where motive becomes practical. The record lists resentment and infidelity. Those words sound simple until you follow what they did to his daily routine. He described his relationship with his girlfriend, Nichol Kessinger, as a relationship that made him feel more in control because she asked his opinion and asked what he wanted to do. He described feeling like he could be himself around her in a way he did not feel with his wife. This is one of the most common dangers of an affair. It does not merely add a person to your life. It reshapes the way you interpret your existing life. It turns ordinary responsibility into a weight because the affair creates a competing world where responsibility feels lighter. It turns your home into the place you return to when you have to, rather than the place you want to be. He described doing ordinary dating activities with Kessinger, going to a movie, walking around together, visiting places he said he enjoyed, attending a drag race, going camping in the Great Sand Dunes. These details may seem small, but they matter because they explain the emotional shape of his double life. He had a home life built around routine, children, pregnancy, and bills. He had an affair life built around choice, novelty, and freedom. The more time he spent in that second world, the more the first world could begin to feel like an obstacle rather than a family. He also described a specific pattern that reveals the danger in plain terms. During the period when Shanann and the girls were in North Carolina, he said he stayed at Kessinger's house almost every night. He described coming home after work to work out, eat dinner, and then going to Kessinger's house, sleeping there nearly the entire month of July. He described that being away from home allowed him not to think about being a father and husband because he was not surrounded by reminders of his family. That sentence is one of the clearest descriptions of how avoidance can become a lifestyle. When a person trains himself to avoid reminders of his own responsibilities, he begins to treat those responsibilities as something that can be escaped instead of something that must be faced. There was also friction, and friction matters because it shows the affair was not a dream world with no consequences. He described waking up on July 4th at Kessinger's house and seeing multiple missed calls from Shanann. He described calling her back and finding her angry, demanding to know where he was. He described trying to cover the situation by saying he was sleeping. And he described Kessinger asking if he would come back and reacting with anger when he left. He described Kessinger telling him she feared she would always be second. And he described her researching online whether a mistress could become a real relationship. This is the reality behind the fantasy. A double life is not stable. It creates pressure on both sides. It creates suspicion at home and insecurity in the affair. It forces a person to lie repeatedly, and repeated lying changes how a person thinks. In the first week of August, he told investigators that he told Kessinger he had talked to Shanann about separating, and he said Kessinger began looking for apartments for him. He also said she never asked him to get rid of his family. He said the relationship contributed to the murders, but he did not present her as directing him to do anything. This matters because it keeps responsibility where the law placed it. An affair can be fuel. It is not the hand that carries out the act. It is one of the forces that makes the act feel to the perpetrator like a path instead of a cliff. The unborn baby, Nico, sat inside that background tension like a clock that could not be stopped. In the follow-up interview, he described that Shanann chose the name Nico and had always liked it. He described that she was the one who picked the spelling. Those details matter because they emphasize that the pregnancy was not an abstract fact. It was a real future the family had already begun to name and shape. A name is a commitment. A name is a way of admitting that the future is coming, whether you are ready or not. This is where the case becomes even more disturbing, because the follow-up record also contains details about what he did after the murders that show awareness, staging, and narrative management. He described placing Shanann's phone and watch in a visible location in the house after killing her. He described taking off her wedding ring and placing it on a counter in a way that he believed would suggest she did not want to fix the marriage and wanted a divorce. He described throwing away a therapy book so it would look like she believed nothing would work in their marriage. These are not the actions of a man who lost control for a single moment and then woke up in shock. These are the actions of a man trying to shape the story that police and family would see when they entered the home. They are attempts to plant an interpretation. They are attempts to turn murder into disappearance and disappearance into a marital decision. He also described his actions during the welfare check on the afternoon of August 13th in a way that reveals how performance can happen right beside law enforcement. He described going in through the garage door and opening the front door for police. He described running upstairs and pretending to look around for Shanann and the girls. He described the brief window of time in the house before opening the door, and he described the phone being found. This is one of the most chilling aspects of the case, because it shows that he understood in that moment that the house held evidence, and he still chose to play the role of the searching husband. He described discarding bedding the next day because he believed it was contaminated evidence from the killing. That detail matters because it again shows consciousness of guilt. People who act in blind panic do not always think like this. People who understand evidence think like this. People who are trying to survive the aftermath think like this. He also described picking up his father and recognizing that it might be the last time he would see him outside prison. The phrase is chilling because it implies that even as he continued moving through ordinary life, work schedules, phone calls, family logistics, he already understood that the end was coming. The end was not only the end of his family, it was also the end of his own life as a free person. And yet, he kept going. He kept speaking. He kept performing. This is what the follow-up interview adds to the public understanding of the Watts case. It shows the internal logic that a killer tried to build for himself after the fact. It shows the way he described the affair as a blinder that narrowed his vision. It shows the way he described his home life as something he could mentally step away from when his wife and daughters were out of state. It shows the way he described being pulled into a world where he felt wanted and in control, while his marriage became a space of conflict, accountability, and pressure. But it also shows something more important than motive. It shows intent expressed through actions. It shows staging expressed through objects. It shows consciousness of guilt expressed through cleanup and through performance. It shows the difference between feeling trapped and choosing annihilation. Millions of people feel trapped in their lives. Most of them choose separation, therapy, bankruptcy, or rebuilding. They choose a messy life over an unforgivable act. In this case, he chose an act that could not be reversed, and then he tried to arrange the evidence so the act would look like something else. The reason this matters to a true crime audience is not because it provides closure. It does not. Nothing about this case provides closure because closure would require the return of a mother and her children. The reason it matters is that it explains how a man can maintain a calm exterior while living a hidden inner trajectory. It explains how a person can practice avoidance until avoidance becomes a plan. It explains how the double life can make the real life feel disposable. It explains why the public plea outside the house felt hollow in hindsight, because the follow-up record suggests he was already shaping the narrative inside the house before he ever spoke outside it. The follow-up interview also reveals why the case remained so magnetic to the public. It is not only the brutality of the ending, it is the ordinariness of the steps that led there. It is a phone filled with family pictures. It is a drive to work on a Monday. It is a garage door opening and closing. It is a welfare check that should have been routine. It is a man going upstairs and pretending to search. It is a wedding ring placed where it could be found. It is a therapy book thrown away to suggest a story. It is the appearance of a marriage dissolving, used as cover for a family being destroyed. In the end, the follow-up record does not change the legal outcome. It reinforces it. It shows why the case was not a mystery for long once pressure was applied. It shows why investigators moved from concern to certainty. It shows how quickly a lie can collapse when it has to sit on real time, real objects, and recorded behavior. And it shows why the Watts case continues to feel like a warning that is difficult to accept, because it suggests that the surface can remain normal right up until the moment it disappears. When investigators returned to talk to Christopher Watts in February of 2019, it was not because the case needed a verdict. The verdict was already locked. The purpose was to complete the record, to remove the gaps that remain when a case ends quickly, and understand the choices that turned a normal week into a permanent sentence. They met him at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. Staff led them into a large open room that they called the computer room, even though it was lined with empty cubicles and no computers. Watts told them he had not expected to see them again. He said prison felt easier than the Weld County Jail in Colorado, where he could hear other inmates yelling threats at him and telling him to kill himself. He described how the jail had to lock down the unit just for him to move down a hallway. He said he could call his parents and his sister now. And he said he received letters from strangers, some calling him a monster, some trying to connect with him as if he were a story instead of a person. The agents told him they were not there to speak about an open investigation. They told him they wanted to fully understand what happened. Watts agreed. In that moment, the conversation changed from the tension of an interrogation into the slow pressure of explanation. A person can plead guilty without telling the whole truth. A person can plead guilty and still keep control over certain details. And in a case like this, details matter because they reveal intent, and because intent is what separates an impulse from a path. The investigators also told him they wanted to ask about other people who had claimed to have had affairs with him during his marriage. Watts denied knowing the man from Wyoming who claimed a relationship and denied ever using the messaging application that was mentioned. He also denied knowing the woman whose photo he was shown. The point of those questions was not to create scandal. The point was to make sure the background of his double life was not being distorted by rumors, because rumors can contaminate a public record, and because the public record is supposed to be precise. Then the conversation returned to what was not rumor, his relationship with Nichol Kessinger. Watts described the affair as something that began with workplace contact and then moved into regular communication. He described how he had spent more time in the office after becoming a field coordinator, which meant he ran into Kessinger more often. He said he initially thought it was just flirting and that he wished he had been out in the field. More so, he never got close to her. He described meeting up after he returned from a trip with his wife to San Diego in late June of 2018 and then seeing Kessinger frequently through July. He described secrecy as a routine. He said Shanann checked his personal phone, so he communicated with Kessinger on his work phone. He said he used a secret calculator application on his personal phone to store pictures of himself and Kessinger. He said he deleted his Facebook account on August 8, 2018, after Kessinger told him she had told her friends about him, and he said he was afraid her friends would look him up and find his family. When you put those actions in order, they form a pattern that is more revealing than any single statement. He was not simply hiding a relationship. He was building a system to hide it, and building a system requires planning. Watts talked about the way the affair affected his thinking. He said that when he opened his phone and saw pictures of his wife and children, he questioned what he was doing with Kessinger. He said that when he was with Kessinger, it felt like he did not think, like he had a blinder in his face. He described the most important month in the background, July, when Shanann and the girls were in North Carolina. He said he stayed at Kessinger's house almost every night during that period. He said he went home after work to work out and eat dinner, then went to Kessinger's house and slept there almost the entire month of July. He said that with his wife and daughters out of state, he did not have time at home to think about his marriage. That sentence sounds small, but it is a description of avoidance becoming a lifestyle. When someone trains himself not to think about his family, he can begin to treat the family as a problem to remove rather than a responsibility to face. He also described how the Thrive products intersected with his daily life. He said that when he wore specific patches, his Apple Watch would show he was exercising all day because his heart rate stayed elevated. He said the patch made him feel like he could go longer and longer each day, and he said he was only sleeping about 3 hours per night. He also said Kessinger told him he would sometimes fall asleep mid-conversation and then wake up and continue talking, and he suggested insomnia could have been part of it. None of that explains murder, but it is part of the picture of his state. A man living in secrecy, running on little sleep, splitting his time between a family home and an affair home, and trying to maintain a normal face while his private life became unstable. The investigators asked about what he planned to do after the murders, about the missing family narrative he tried to maintain. Watts said he had no idea what he was going to do. He said he did not understand how he was able to act normal around his coworkers. He said his plan was not well thought out and was not a Criminal Minds type of thing. That statement sounds like an attempt to reduce the sense of deliberate intention, as if the aftermath was chaos rather than design. But the same interview includes details that show he did design certain parts of the aftermath, and those parts matter more than his self-description. Watts admitted that after he murdered Shanann, he tried to plant evidence in the home. He said he threw her cell phone and Apple Watch on the couch. He said that if he had planned it, he would have taken her items out to the oil site with him, which again was an attempt to frame his behavior as disorganized. But then he described acts that were not accidental. He said he took off Shanann's wedding ring and put it on the counter so it would look like she did not want to fix the marriage and wanted a divorce. He said he threw a therapy book away in the trash so it would look like she believed nothing would work in their marriage. In other words, he tried to create a story in the house. He tried to build a visual narrative that a wife had left and had made a final decision about the marriage. That is not panic. That is staging. He described the welfare check in a way that made the staging even darker. He said that when police arrived at the house, he went in through the garage and opened the front door for law enforcement. He said he ran upstairs and pretended to look around for Shanann and the girls. He said that Atkinson's son found Shanann's cell phone. He described being in the house for roughly a minute before opening the door, and he described uncertainty about whether he looked into Shanann's vehicle in the garage, while acknowledging that it was possible he opened the passenger door because the friend had mentioned the girls' car seats. What makes that moment chilling is that he is describing performance. He is describing how he acted out the role of a searching husband while knowing the outcome. He also described physical cleanup. He said he threw the bedsheet away the day after the murders because strangulation can cause a person to evacuate their bowels, and he said that occurred, which he offered as the reason he discarded the sheet. Again, this is not a detail people share to reveal truth. It is a detail that reveals consciousness of evidence. It shows he understood that the home contained traces and that traces could betray him. He described the morning he picked up his father at the airport as strange because he knew it was probably the last time he would see his father on the outside. That sentence matters because it suggests he knew, even while continuing his ordinary movements, that the story would not hold. He knew the end was coming. He kept speaking anyway. He kept moving anyway. He kept lying anyway. The interview also touched the legal choices that ended the case quickly. Watts said he pleaded guilty because he did not want people to go through years of court. He said he did not want his attorneys to fight for a story that was not true. He said his attorneys were ready to fight and had motions prepared, but he did not want the process to continue. He said he did not regret taking the plea deal, even though he never thought he would be in prison for the rest of his life. He said his parents believed he was railroaded and pressured, and he said they sometimes told him to fight the conviction. He described how they discussed possible defenses and theories, but he did not present them as something that could erase what happened. He described his own awareness that he was in charge of his decisions regarding the case. He described another detail that shows how image management followed him even into court. He said his attorneys told him he needed to show more emotion so he would not look like a cold person. He said his attorneys offered him the option to look at crime scene photos, and he refused. He said he prayed for the workers who had to see the aftermath, and he said he did not want Shanann's parents to see those pictures or to have to hear people talk about what they saw or hear anyone damage Shanann's memory in public. In this part of the interview, he is trying to present a moral frame, a frame where he is guilty but also protective, as if the plea was a mercy and the silence was a form of respect. The record does not require us to accept that frame. The record only requires us to notice that even after the murders, even after the confession, he still cared about how the story would be told and how he would be seen inside it. He also described the consequences of speaking to the media early. He said he ended up lying to more and more people by talking to the media. He said he heard that he looked heartless and soulless. That sentence connects directly to why the case became so widely known. The public did not only hear about the crime after an arrest. The public saw the performance before the arrest and then watched the performance collapse. Once that happens, the footage becomes permanent. It becomes a loop that plays in documentaries, in news specials, and in people's minds, because it captures the exact moment when a story was still possible and then became impossible. The interview also included his account of Kessinger's role and his claims about what she knew. He said that around the first week of August, he told her he had talked to Shanann about separating and that Kessinger began looking for apartments for him. He said she never asked him to get rid of his family. He said the relationship contributed to the murders, but she never asked him to do anything. He also described Kessinger saying she wished she could give him a son, and he said she did not know Shanann was pregnant. He said it was possible she saw the pregnancy on Facebook, but she never mentioned it to him if she did. This part matters because it shows how he tried to draw a line between contribution and instruction, between influence and command, keeping the guilt fixed where the guilty plea placed it while still admitting the affair's emotional force, and then the interview returned to the unborn baby. Because the pregnancy was a clock that made everything feel heavier. Watts said Shanann picked the name Nico. He said he wanted a different spelling and Shanann refused. He said Nico was an Italian name Shanann always liked, and that he did not get to pick any of the children's names, but told her he liked them. It is a small detail, but it carries weight, because it shows the future had already been shaped in the home. The baby had a name, the family had a plan, and, at the same time, Watts was building a secret system on his phone, deleting accounts, hiding pictures, and sleeping at another house. When you put the February interview together as a whole, it reads like a map of two lives colliding. It reads like a description of a man trying to control perception while losing control of reality. It shows a person capable of staging evidence and capable of pretending to search while police were present. It shows a person who understood the power of objects. A ring on a counter, a book in the trash, a phone on a couch. Because objects can suggest a story before anyone speaks. It also shows why this case remains a warning that never feels comfortable. The motive is summarized in resentment and infidelity, but the interview reveals how those motives are lived in practice. They are lived in secret phones. They are lived in deleted accounts. They are lived in nights spent away from home while the family is out of state. They are lived in the mental habit of not thinking about a marriage because it is easier not to think than to confront. And most of all, it shows that the collapse was not only moral, it was operational. The staging was not good enough. The performance did not hold. The timeline was too tight. A friend acted too fast. Police arrived too soon. Questions returned too often. The story had too many holes, and the moment it had to sit under pressure, it broke. This is why investigators went back to him in prison. They were documenting not only the crime, but the story he tried to build around the crime. They were documenting the gap between what he did and what he wanted people to believe he did. They were documenting the systems of secrecy that supported the affair because those systems are part of the motive. They were documenting the staging in the house because staging reveals intent. They were documenting the performance during the welfare check because that performance reveals consciousness of guilt. He paid for it. The case did not need him to be convicted again. It needed the record to be complete. And once you understand what the February interview adds, the earlier footage becomes even more haunting. The plea outside the house was not only a man talking to cameras. It was a man who, by his own later description, had already planted a false narrative inside the house and then walked out to sell that narrative to the world. That is what makes the Watts case endure. It is not only the violence, it is the attempt to turn violence into a story that sounds like a marriage ending. And the speed at which that story collapsed when real objects, real time, and real witnesses refused to cooperate. The reason the Watts case moved so fast is not luck, and it is not a single breakthrough. It is a chain of small constraints that built pressure hour by hour until there was no space left to hide a story. It started with timing. Shanann Watts arrived home from a business trip to Arizona in the early morning hours of August 13, 2018. Later that day, she did not respond to calls and messages. She missed a scheduled doctor appointment. Those are not dramatic facts, but they are measurable facts. When a person has a routine, a break in that routine becomes an alarm. A friend, Nicole Atkinson, treated that alarm as urgent. She went to the Watts home on Saratoga Trail. She found Shanann's car in the garage with the children's car seats still inside it. She tried the front door and found it was secured from the inside by a latch that prevented it from opening more than a few inches. She did not leave in hope it would resolve itself. She called law enforcement for a welfare check. When an officer arrived, the officer checked windows and doors, including a rear sliding door, and found the home locked with no easy entry. The officer contacted Christopher Watts and asked for the keypad code for the garage. Watts said the code did not work and said he was only minutes away. When Watts arrived, the officer entered the home with his consent to look for Shanann and the children. This is where the case begins to shift, because the house did not look like a family that left on purpose. It looked like a family that stopped in place. Detective Dave Boynhover responded to the scene and arrived that afternoon. He was briefed and learned that Shanann's personal items, including her phone, purse, wallet, and medication, were located in the house. He observed Shanann's purse on a kitchen island. He observed a suitcase at the bottom of the stairs leading upstairs. He observed a pair of women's shoes near the front door. Upstairs, he observed that the bed in the master bedroom had been stripped of its bedding, with the bedding on the floor. He later learned Shanann's phone was found in the loft area between the bedrooms, tucked between couch cushions. Each of those observations is a small piece of friction against the idea of voluntary disappearance. A pregnant woman does not usually leave her medication behind. A mother does not usually leave her phone behind. A person who walks out of a marriage does not usually leave behind the objects that make leaving possible. At the same time, Watts began giving a narrative. He said Shanann arrived home around 2 in the morning. He said he woke around 5 in the morning and talked with her about separation, and that the conversation was civil but emotional. He said he left for work around 5:27 in the morning, backing his truck up to the garage to load tools. He said Shanann was in bed when he left. He said she told him she was going to a friend's house later that day with the children, but he did not know the friend's name. This is where modern evidence starts to narrow the story. The affidavit notes that a neighbor's video surveillance system recorded the truck backing up to the garage and leaving shortly after. That video did not prove murder by itself, but it fixed the timeline. It put an exact time on an action that matched the suspect's account. It also created a question that would not go away. If Shanann and the girls left later, where was the proof of them leaving? That evening, a neighborhood canvass was conducted. A be on the lookout was initiated through dispatch. The next morning, August 14th, investigators learned neither Shanann nor the girls had returned home. Detective Boynhover requested an immediate press release and initiated assistance from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. While the public still saw a missing family story, investigators were already treating it like a high-risk disappearance because the physical facts inside the home did not match the story Watts was telling. Then the case tightened in a second way, through the discovery of what Watts had denied. According to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation report that documents the polygraph and related interview, Watts denied during an interview with an FBI agent that he had any knowledge of where his wife and children were. He was also adamant there was no infidelity in his marriage. He agreed to take a polygraph. On the morning of August 15th, a regional security manager at Anadarko advised the agent that he had reviewed Watts's computer network traffic and that it was possible Watts had started a relationship with an Anadarko contract employee, Nichol Kessinger. The security manager described locating emails between them and believed the relationship started around June of 2018. The emails were to be forwarded to law enforcement. That detail matters because it adds a motive vector that Watts had tried to keep out of the investigation. Affairs do not automatically lead to murder, but an affair can explain why a person might lie about separation, why a person might feel pressure to control a narrative, and why a person might see his family as an obstacle instead of as the center of his life. Later that day, the polygraph was conducted at the Frederick Police Department. Watts voluntarily consented. The agent advised him of his rights and obtained signed consent forms. The report states that the polygraph showed deception indicated. Once a lie is detected in an environment where the suspect has agreed to cooperate, the psychological space changes. The suspect loses the comfort of believing he can talk his way out with calm statements. Every answer begins to sound like a test. Every denial becomes a risk. After the test, the pressure moved from general questions into specific contradictions. The report records that Watts had removed his wedding ring during the process. It records numerous statements he made about his marriage, about separation, about finances, and about how unusual it was that Shanann's wedding ring was left behind. Those details are the kind of domestic facts that seem small until you realize what they do in an interview room. They force a suspect to build an internal map of the family's normal habits, and then explain why that normal pattern broke in a way that benefits him. As the investigation continued, the story reached the moment where Watts stopped trying to hold the "she left" narrative and began offering an explanation built to redirect blame. In the warrantless arrest affidavit, after being allowed to speak with his father, Watts said he returned to speak with Shanann again and claimed he saw Shanann harming the children. He claimed he then strangled Shanann. He claimed he loaded all 3 bodies into his work truck and took them to an Anadarko oil site identified as Survey 319. He claimed he buried Shanann near 2 tanks and put the girls in the oil tanks. The affidavit also states he identified locations on an aerial photograph. The affidavit records that before his confession, investigators had arrived at Survey 319 with consent to initiate a drone search. Investigators spotted a bed sheet in the field near the tank battery. The sheet matched the pattern of pillowcases and a top sheet recovered from a kitchen trash can from the Watts residence earlier that day. The drone search also revealed fresh movement of dirt consistent with the clandestine grave near the tanks. This is another reason the case collapsed quickly. Investigators were not only listening to a confession, they were already moving toward verification. They were already connecting objects from the home to what appeared in the field. They were already narrowing the world to one location where a story could be proven or destroyed. The public record also shows how quickly the legal process turned once the core facts were locked. In early November, Watts pleaded guilty to murdering his pregnant wife and 2 children, and he pleaded guilty to all counts charged. The Weld County District Attorney's Office stated that he faced the possibility of the death penalty or life in prison without parole, and that with the agreement of the victim's family, the district attorney eliminated the death penalty from consideration in exchange for the guilty plea to all counts. When you step back, you can see the shape of the case without relying on rumor or on emotion. A friend acted quickly. Police were at the house the same day. The physical scene did not match a voluntary disappearance. A neighbor's camera locked in a key time window. A press release and agency assistance accelerated the search. Employment-related evidence exposed a hidden relationship the suspect had denied. A polygraph indicated deception. The suspect's narrative shifted from "they left" to "I did not do this until she did something," which is a classic move to lower blame. Verification moved faster than denial could adapt. The suspect gave a location. Investigators corroborated with drone observation and recovered items. The legal outcome followed with a plea that closed the case without years of trial. That is what makes this case hard to look away from. It is not just the brutality of what happened. It is the speed with which an ordinary missing person story turned into a documented collapse of deception. It is also the way the deception was built. Watts's early statements leaned on normal language. He talked about separation, about emotions, about leaving for work, about a friend's house, about not knowing details. It sounded like a marriage problem and a confusing morning. It sounded like something that could still turn into a safe return. But the objects in the house did not cooperate with that tone. The friend who acted quickly did not cooperate with that tone. The neighbor's camera did not cooperate with that tone. The employer's network evidence did not cooperate with that tone. The polygraph did not cooperate with that tone. And once the story had to stand against physical verification in a specific place, it failed. The broader context is recorded in public summaries as well. The murders occurred in Frederick, Colorado, in the early hours of August 13th. Shanann was killed by strangulation. Bella and Celeste were killed by suffocation. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave near an oil storage facility. The children were placed in crude oil tanks through openings described as only 8 inches in diameter. Watts later received life sentences without the possibility of parole plus additional years. Those are the blunt facts. The reason they remain so disturbing is not only what they describe, it is what they imply. They imply that the gap between normal and catastrophic can be short. They imply that a person can stand inside an ordinary house and speak ordinary sentences while the reality is already hidden somewhere else. They imply that when evidence is modern and immediate, a lie does not have time to grow roots. This is the point in the story where the public no longer had a missing family to search for. The investigation had moved into a different phase. It had moved into recovery, documentation, and permanent consequences. And it had moved into something else, too. The long afterlife of a case that left behind a tight timeline, a recorded collapse, and a set of official documents that show exactly how fast an ordinary morning can become irreversible. By the morning of August 15th, the case had already reached the point where time stopped being a backdrop and started becoming a weapon. Every hour that passed without a credible sighting made the missing story harder to defend. Every object left behind in the house made the idea of a voluntary disappearance feel less and less believable. And every time Christopher Watts repeated his account, investigators listened for what did not fit. That day, he agreed to take a polygraph at the Frederick Police Department. He arrived around 11 in the morning. He was dressed casually, in a short-sleeved North Carolina Tar Heel shirt, athletic shorts, and flip-flops. He was not wearing his wedding ring. In the interview room, the polygraph agent explained the procedures and told him something important, that he was not under arrest and he could leave. The door was closed for privacy and it automatically locked from the inside, but a key was in the lock to open it. The agent was not dressed like a patrol officer and was not wearing a gun or badge. The goal was to remove the feeling of force, because people talk more freely when they believe they are choosing to be there. But the pressure was already building in the background before the first polygraph question was even asked. About 3 hours before the scheduled polygraph, Anadarko's regional security manager contacted the polygraph agent and explained he had reviewed Watts' computer network activity. He said it appeared Watts had been in a relationship with an Anadarko contract employee, Nichol Kessinger, and he said he had located emails between them. This mattered because Watts had been adamant there was no infidelity in his marriage. When a person denies something and a third-party record contradicts that denial, it does not only create motive, it damages credibility in everything else he says. The polygraph began with a pretest interview, and that pretest is where investigators often learn the most. A polygraph is not just wires in a machine, it is structured conversation. It forces a suspect to define what certain words mean. It forces him to commit to yes or no answers. It forces him to settle into the story he plans to keep. But Watts talked about his background, his work, and his routine. He talked about how he worked at Anadarko, how he usually started early, and how he knew the oil sites by memory. He talked about the night before, how he had stayed at the home of friends connected to Shanann's circle. He spoke in the language of an ordinary person dealing with an abnormal situation. as if normal details could stabilize the narrative. Then the focus returned to the missing family, and the questions became direct. The polygraph agent's purpose was simple: determine whether Watts had knowledge or involvement in the disappearance of his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. Watts consented. He signed forms. He agreed to the examination. And according to the investigative report, the result indicated deception. In real life, that moment is not dramatic the way it is in movies. There is no explosion. There is a change in tone. There is a shift from open-ended conversation to controlled confrontation. A lie is a structure. When the structure cracks, the person holding it often tries to rebuild it with a new shape. That is what happened next. Watts asked to speak with his father. His father was present at the police department. After that conversation, Watts stopped trying to hold the simple version of the story, the version where Shanann took the kids and left. Instead, he offered a confession designed to redirect blame. He claimed that after he told Shanann he wanted a separation, he returned to the bedroom and saw something that made him rage. He claimed he saw Shanann harming their children. He claimed he then strangled Shanann. He claimed he loaded all 3 bodies into his work truck and drove to an Anadarko oil site, known as Survey 319. He claimed he buried Shanann near the tanks and put the girls into the oil tanks. The confession contained 2 parts: the part that admitted he killed Shanann, and the part that attempted to make him sound like he acted only after she had harmed the children. That second part was a story inside the confession. It was a narrative he chose to tell after the first narrative had failed. But investigators were not relying only on his words. They were moving in parallel. Before his confession was complete, investigators had already gone to Survey 319 with consent to begin a drone search. The affidavit later stated that around 4:15 in the afternoon, investigators spotted a bedsheet in the field near the tank battery. The sheet's pattern matched bedding items recovered earlier from a kitchen trash can at the Watts home. The drone search also showed fresh movement of dirt consistent with a clandestine grave near the tanks. This is one of the most important truths about how cases are solved. Confessions are useful, but verification is decisive. A suspect can confess and still lie. A suspect can confess and still attempt to protect himself. But physical evidence does not negotiate, and time-stamped movement on a scene does not care about the story a suspect prefers. Once the investigation reached that point, the missing persons case was already collapsing into something else. It was becoming a recovery operation. The affidavit, written for the warrantless arrest, documented the early welfare check as well, and the domestic details that made a voluntary disappearance unlikely. It documented that Shanann's friend raised the alarm the same day Shanann returned home. It documented that Shanann's car was in the garage with the children's car seats inside. It documented that the front door latch prevented entry more than a few inches. It documented that officers found the home locked and needed Watts to return. It documented that inside the home, Shanann's personal items, including her purse, her medication, and her phone, were located there. It documented that the bed in the master bedroom had been stripped with bedding on the floor. It documented that Watts told police Shanann had said she was going to a friend's house, but he did not know the friend's name. It documented that a neighbor's surveillance recorded Watts backing his truck up to the garage to load tools and leaving shortly after. Those details form a pattern. They show how quickly investigators began measuring his story against observable facts. A missing family story can survive when the world is vague. It dies when the world becomes specific. The polygraph day is where specificity finally trapped him. The machine result did not convict him by itself. The machine result simply removed the comfort of denial. It created a moment where he had to choose between continuing the lie and offering an alternative story that sounded, to him, less damning. That is why the confession arrived the way it did. He did not say, "I planned this." He did not say, "I wanted to erase my family." He offered a scenario where he could claim moral outrage, where he could claim he reacted, where he could claim he did not begin by harming his children. He tried to build a confession that would still leave him a narrow space to stand in. But the evidence at Survey 319 was not a narrow space. It was a closing door. In the public record that followed, would show that this case was never going to be decided by how calm he sounded or how many times he repeated his story. It was going to be decided by the chain of actions that left traces in a house, by the digital trail that exposed what he tried to hide, by the camera footage that anchored time, and by the physical evidence that investigators could see from the sky. This is where the Watts case stops being a story about a man searching for his family and becomes a story about a man trying to control what the world will believe after he has already destroyed them. And once a person crosses that line, the only question left is how long the control will last. In this case, it lasted for only a few days. After he pointed to the locations on the aerial photograph, the investigation stopped being theoretical. It became physical. It became measurable. It became a search for proof in the same dirt and steel he worked around every day. In his first version of events, he claimed the oil site was Survey 319. He claimed he loaded his pregnant wife and both children into his work truck. He claimed he buried Shanann near 2 oil tanks and placed the girls inside the tanks. He claimed this was done to hide what happened and to make the scene disappear into the routine of an industrial landscape. Investigators were already moving in that direction before he finished talking. They were able to begin a drone search of the area with consent. In the late afternoon, investigators reported spotting a bedsheet in the field near the tank battery. They noted that the pattern matched bedding items associated with the Watts home. The drone search also showed fresh movement of dirt consistent with a concealed grave near the oil tanks. That combination mattered because it was not a rumor or a hunch. It was a visible, recorded contradiction to the story of a voluntary disappearance. Once that evidence existed, there was no path back to an ordinary missing persons case. There was only the next step, securing the suspect and locking down the scene before anything could be changed. That night, Christopher Watts was arrested. The warrantless arrest affidavit lists his arrest time as 11:02 p.m. on August 15, 2018. The affidavit was written to establish probable cause, and it put the core facts into a legal container that could survive in court. It also captured something else. It captured the way his story evolved and how quickly it had to evolve because the world around him had stopped accepting it. By the next day, the public statements reflected what investigators were already confronting. Authorities announced that Shanann Watts' body had been found on property owned by Anadarko Petroleum, the company tied to the worksite where he had gone that morning. Investigators were still searching for the girls. In plain terms, the case had moved from fear to confirmation, and from confirmation to recovery. The language used by officials was careful, but the meaning was clear. The search had ended in the place his own movements had pointed toward. From that point forward, every court date and every document served one purpose. It replaced speculation with charges, and it replaced charges with a permanent sentence. On August 20, 2018, the Weld County District Attorney formally filed a criminal complaint and information that laid out 9 counts. The filing included multiple counts of first-degree murder, a count tied to the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. On paper, the case stopped being a headline and became a numbered structure, designed to be proven count by count. The legal process then accelerated toward a decision that would prevent a trial from unfolding in public. In early November, Watts pleaded guilty to all 9 counts. The district attorney's office stated that the death penalty was removed from consideration with the agreement of the victim's family in exchange for guilty pleas to every listed charge. The plea removed uncertainty about a verdict, but it did not soften the outcome. It only changed the route the case took to reach it. Sentencing came later that month. Court reporting and official statements described the result in blunt terms. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with multiple life sentences structured to ensure he would never leave custody. Additional years were added for the unlawful termination of pregnancy and for tampering charges connected to the handling and concealment of the bodies. This is how the Watts case ended in court. It ended not with a mystery solved over months, but with a collapse that happened in days. It ended because his movements were observable, his lies were checkable, and the location he chose to hide everything was the same place he could not explain away. The rest of the story, the part that people still argue about, is not about what the court decided. It is about why he tried to rewrite the moment of origin, why he offered a version that shifted blame, and why he believed he could control the narrative after the facts had already escaped him. And that is where the case becomes more than a file. It becomes a warning about how quickly an ordinary life can be used as camouflage, and how quickly that camouflage fails when reality becomes specific. Before the polygraph, before the confession, and before the oil site became a name, the public learned by heart the case was already being built in a quieter way, through ordinary procedure. On the afternoon of August 13th, a welfare check began with one small obstacle: a front door that would not open more than a few inches because of a latch on the inside. A friend had come to the house because Shanann was not answering calls or texts and had missed a doctor appointment. The friend saw Shanann's car in the garage with the children's car seats still inside. The friend called police because the silence felt medically dangerous, not just emotionally strange. When the officer arrived, the officer checked doors and windows and found the home locked. The officer called Christopher Watts and asked for the garage keypad code. Watts said the code did not work and said he was only minutes away. When Watts arrived, the officer entered the home with his consent to look for Shanann and the children. Inside, the details did not match a clean departure. Detective Dave Baumhofer arrived and learned that Shanann's personal effects, including her phone, purse, wallet, and medication, were located in the house. He saw her purse on the kitchen island. He saw a suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. He saw women's shoes near the front door. Upstairs, he saw the master bed stripped of its bedding, with the bedding on the floor. In the loft area between the bedrooms, Shanann's cell phone was later found tucked between couch cushions. Watts gave an explanation that sounded like a marriage breaking, not a crime. He said Shanann arrived home around 2 a.m. He said he woke around 5 a.m. and told her he wanted a separation, and he described the conversation as civil but emotional. He said he backed his truck up to the garage around 5:27 a.m. to load tools and left for work, and he said Shanann was in bed when he left. He said she told him she was going to a friend's house later that day with the children, but he said he did not know the friend's name. Then the story began to tighten, not through accusations, but through time-stamped reality. A neighbor's video surveillance system recorded Watts backing his truck into the driveway and leaving shortly after. The same neighbor system captured the friend's vehicle leaving earlier in the morning after dropping Shanann off. The investigation now had a fixed window that did not care how calm his voice sounded. That same day, Watts also consented to officers checking Shanann's phone and ultimately surrendered it so it could be examined for information about where she and the children might be. By the next morning, August 14th, the family still had not returned, and investigators treated that as an emergency, not a waiting game. Detective Baumhover requested an immediate press release and initiated assistance from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That night, August 14th, at 7:08 p.m., Watts sat down at the police station for a recorded interview with an FBI agent, Graham Coder, and he began doing something that seems harmless until you understand what it does to a person who is lying. He began building a timeline on paper. Coder told him, calmly, that memory fades and investigators would ask him the same questions again and again. He told him they would ask about small things that feel stupid, what he ate, what he did, what he saw, because small things add up. Then he handed him a form and asked him to start from the beginning and write everything he could remember. Watts agreed. He asked if he should include times. He asked if he should start from when she got home. He joked that it felt like being in high school again. Then he began writing, alone in the room, while investigators moved in and out, collecting other statements and building the perimeter of the case. This is the moment many people miss when they look back at the footage and the headlines. The collapse did not begin when he failed a polygraph. The collapse began when the system made him commit to specifics. A lie can float when it is general. A lie sinks when it has to attach itself to a written timeline, because every minute becomes a place where verification can be inserted. At this stage, Watts was still presenting the same basic story, that Shanann and the girls had gone somewhere during the day, and he did not know where. But every fact investigators had from the home pushed against that story. The phone was inside. The purse was inside. The medication was inside. The car was in the garage with the car seats. The front door latch had been engaged from inside. The bed had been stripped. The suitcase was there. The wedding ring would be found later. And he could not name the friend's house they supposedly went to. When a person is innocent, these contradictions create fear and urgency. When a person is guilty, contradictions create something else. They create a need to control the narrative before the narrative controls him. By then, the investigation was already moving into motive as well as timeline. The affidavit later stated that a 2-day investigation revealed Watts was actively involved in an affair with a coworker, which he had denied in previous interviews. In plain terms, investigators were now looking at a double life, not just a missing family. This is why the August 14th interview matters. It sits between two worlds. On the surface, it is a missing persons conversation about where a family could have gone. Underneath, it is the beginning of a narrowing corridor, where every written line and every recorded statement becomes something that can be checked, compared, and used. And that narrowing corridor is what led to the arrest the next night, and then to a court record that refused to let any part of the harm disappear into a single word like tragedy. In the documents that followed, the case was turned into counts. Each count a legal sentence designed to keep the story precise. The guilty plea paperwork listed first-degree murder counts after deliberation for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Additional first-degree murder counts for the children based on age. A first-degree unlawful termination of pregnancy count tied to Nichol, and multiple tampering with a deceased human body counts. That structure is how the state said, in writing, that each life was recognized separately, and that concealment was treated as its own act of violence. So, when people ask how this case moved so fast, the answer is not one dramatic reveal. The answer is a sequence of steps that made the world specific. A latch on a door. A friend who did not wait. A phone left behind. A neighbor's camera. A written timeline. A recorded interview. And then the discovery that the life he was describing in the interview was not the only life he was living. Once those elements were in place, the story could not stay soft. It had to harden into facts. And once a story hardens into facts, a liar runs out of room. After the confession on August 15th, the story stopped being about where they might be and became about what the legal system would do with a man who had already pointed to the place where the evidence was waiting. The rest happened late that night, and the timing mattered because it showed how quickly the case hardened once the investigation had a location and a narrative that could be tested against the ground. For a few days, the public had watched a missing family case unfold in real time, and then, almost suddenly, the language changed. It stopped being a search. It became a homicide investigation with a named suspect. From that point forward, the case moved through documents, because documents are how the system makes truth durable. A story can change in the mouth of a suspect. A story cannot change in a filed record without leaving a trail. In late August, the formal charging document captured the scope in a way that headlines never can. It did not say a family disappeared. It laid out counts, each one tied to a victim, each one separated so nothing could blend into a single tragedy. It included first-degree murder charges. It included a charge for unlawful termination of a pregnancy tied to Shanann's unborn child. And it included multiple counts for tampering with a deceased human body. The language was cold and technical, but it was the state's way of refusing to let any part of the harm be reduced or generalized. What followed was the phase people often imagine as long and dramatic. The phase of hearings, motions, and trial preparation. In most cases, that phase is slow. It drags. It forces families to wait for years. It turns grief into a calendar full of court dates. This case did not take that path. On November 6, 2018, Christopher Watts signed a written waiver and entered guilty pleas. The paper itself is the moment where the courtroom fight ended before it began. By pleading guilty, he gave up the right to a jury trial and the right to force the state to prove its case in open court. He pleaded guilty across the board to all counts charged, and the agreement removed the death penalty from consideration. That removal was not presented as mercy from the state. It was presented as a decision shaped by the victim's family. Prosecutors stated that the death penalty was taken off the table in exchange for guilty pleas to all charges. And they stated that the family agreed to those terms. That detail matters because it explains why the case closed so quickly. It was not only about evidence. It was about finality. A death penalty prosecution can keep a case alive through litigation for decades. A plea deal can end the public process immediately and lock the outcome into place. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the morning of November 19, 2018, and the court issued orders because it understood what that day would become. The courtroom would not simply be a legal formality. It would be a public event, heavily attended, emotionally volatile, and permanent in the public record. When that day arrived, the hearing did two things at once. It finished the legal story, and it allowed the victim's family to speak in the one setting where the murderer could not interrupt, could not redirect, and could not walk away. Shanann's parents stood in court and described a kind of betrayal that is hard to translate into language. They described loving him like a son. They described trusting him. They described the moment they understood they would never hold their grandchildren again. They did not speak like commentators or analysts. They spoke like people whose future had been erased in a single night. Her father described him in terms that were plain and direct Because there is no poetic language that fits a man who destroys his own children. Her mother described what Shanann had believed about her marriage and her family, and she described how that belief had been used against her. The words were not designed to persuade a jury, because there was no jury left to persuade. The words were designed to place the victims back at the center of a story that had been dominated by the killer's face for months. Then Watt's mother spoke, and the courtroom saw a different kind of pain. The pain of a family confronting what their son had done. She told him they still loved him and spoke in the language of forgiveness, even as the reality of the crime sat in the same room. That moment did not soften the outcome. It only showed how crimes like this fracture more than one family, leaving survivors on every side carrying a burden they did not choose. The prosecutor addressed the court with the core argument that now shapes how many people understand this case. The motive was not complicated. The motive was a desire for a fresh start, a desire to begin a new relationship and a new life without the responsibilities of the old one. The prosecution's point was simple. If you want a new life, you get divorced. You do not annihilate your family. When the judge spoke, he did not treat the sentencing as a routine checklist. He described the crime as one of the most inhumane and vicious he had handled in thousands of cases, and he made it clear that nothing less than the maximum sentence would fit the seriousness of what had been done. Then, the court imposed a sentence designed to be permanent. Watts received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Additional life sentences served concurrently, and additional years tied to the termination of the pregnancy and the tampering counts. The structure was deliberate. It ensured that even if some future legal theory tried to weaken one part, the overall outcome would remain locked. This is where the legal story ends, but it is not where the case ends in reality, because after sentencing, the system still had to manage what notoriety does to incarceration. A man like this becomes a target. He becomes a symbol inside a prison, and symbols attract violence. Within weeks, he was moved out of Colorado for security reasons and transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. At the same time, another kind of afterlife began, the public afterlife. Even without a trial, the case produced thousands of pages of investigation material, interviews, timelines, and records that would circulate for years. The evidence did not vanish with the guilty plea. It remained, and because so much of it was recorded early, it gave the public something rare, the feeling that they could rewatch the collapse of a lie from the inside out. That is why this case continues to haunt so many people. It did not end with a long courtroom battle that slowly revealed the truth. It ended with a rapid collapse and an immediate guilty plea, which left a different kind of emptiness behind. People did not get a public trial to answer every question. They got a sentence that closed the door and a record that hinted at what was still unknown. And that emptiness is where speculation tries to live. People ask what he planned and when he planned it. People ask whether the first confession was only a strategy, a final attempt to shift blame. People ask how he could speak calmly to police and to cameras while the truth was already buried at his worksite. People ask why a man would choose the most irreversible option instead of the most ordinary one: divorce, separation, custody, debt, embarrassment, consequences. The sentencing hearing did not answer those questions, and it was never meant to. A sentencing hearing is not an investigation. It is the legal final act. What it did provide was something the victim's family needed the most. A moment where their voices could exist on the official record alongside the charges and the punishment. So the case could not be remembered only as a suspect's face and a headline. The system did what it can do. It ended his freedom permanently. It labeled each death clearly. It documented each act of concealment as its own crime. It imposed the maximum sentence. It moved him to a facility where he would not leave alive. But what the system cannot do is restore the ordinary future that was taken. That future was a mother raising her daughters. That future was two little girls growing into teenagers and adults. That future was a baby boy who already had a name. And that is why, even after the court closed its file, the story kept moving in the minds of the people who watched it unfold. Because the most unsettling part of this case is not that it ended with a permanent sentence. The most unsettling part is how quickly it moved from a normal morning to a locked courtroom, and how little time there was between those two worlds. After the sentencing, the case was legally finished, but the system still had work to do, because the courtroom is not the last place where high-profile crime has consequences. In early December of 2018, corrections officials moved Christopher Watts out of Colorado because of security concerns. He was transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security prison where he would serve the rest of his life. The move was not about punishment. The punishment had already been decided. The move was about containment, because notoriety can turn an inmate into a target, and a target creates instability everywhere he is housed. For Shanann's family, the days after sentencing were not relief. They were the moment after the shock, when reality becomes routine, when the court date is gone, but the absence is permanent. The case had ended with a number of life sentences, but a sentence cannot return a mother, cannot return two little girls, cannot return an unborn baby who already had a name. For the public, the days after sentencing created a different feeling. The public had watched the story unfold in real time. The public had watched the welfare check. The public had watched the driveway interview. The public had watched the confession happen within days. Then the public had watched the case close without a trial. That speed left a vacuum. A trial is where every piece of evidence is laid out in public, where the timeline is argued, where witnesses speak, and where a jury hears the full story. A plea deal shuts that door. It creates finality, but it also leaves questions in the air because many details never get tested in a courtroom narrative. That vacuum is one reason the case did not fade. It did something that many resolved cases do not do. It expanded. Over time, large amounts of investigative material were released publicly through open records processes and media publication. The documents included reports, interviews, and supporting records that showed how the investigation moved, what investigators saw inside the home, how they confronted contradictions, and how quickly the case narrowed once evidence became specific. For people who followed the case, those releases created a second timeline layered on top of the first. The first timeline was the real-time story, a missing family report that became a confession and a recovery. The second timeline was the paperwork timeline, the slow exposure of what investigators already knew while the public was still hoping for a safe return. Then, in February of 2019, the record expanded again in a way that mattered. Investigators visited Watts in prison at Dodge Correctional Institution. The visit included a Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent, an FBI agent, and a detective from Frederick. Their stated purpose was not to reopen the case. Their purpose was to understand what happened and to discuss other claims connected to his life during the marriage. They wanted a fuller account, not because it changed guilt, but because it completed the official record. When the redacted report of that prison interview was released publicly in early March, it created another wave of attention. It showed the same pattern that had appeared from the beginning. He spoke as if he wanted to explain, but he also spoke as if he wanted to manage how the explanation would be understood. He described an affair. He described secrecy. He described staging inside the house. He described decisions that suggested awareness of evidence. The picture that formed was not a single moment of rage that burned out. It was a sequence of choices, followed by efforts to control what others would believe. At the same time, the legal context of the plea deal became more visible as the years passed. Colorado would later repeal the death penalty for offenses charged on or after July 1st, 2020. That did not affect the Watts case, because the plea deal had already removed the death penalty from consideration in 2018, but it framed the case historically. It became one of the high-profile cases from the period just before the state ended capital punishment going forward. As public records and interviews circulated, the case stopped being only a local tragedy and became a national reference point for a specific kind of crime: the deliberate destruction of a family by the person who is supposed to protect it. This is where media changed the case's afterlife. It moved from news coverage into documentary storytelling. In late September of 2020, Netflix released a documentary titled American Murder: The Family Next Door. It presented the case using raw, first-hand materials, including law enforcement recordings, social media content, and messages. The approach mattered because it did not feel like a retelling built years later. It felt like a timeline built from the family's own recorded presence, then the sudden silence, then the investigation moving through that silence. That format did something powerful and unsettling. It made the audience live inside the normal life that existed right up to the moment it ended. It made the disappearance feel immediate again. It made the early texts and calls feel like the last threads of a future that was about to be cut. And it reinforced the central contradiction that keeps people returning to the case. The surface looked normal until it did not. The house looked normal until it became a crime scene. The language sounded normal until it was revealed as performance. The timeline looked ordinary until it was fixed to a work site where bodies were hidden in a way that felt impossible to imagine. After the Netflix documentary, the case continued to attract new statements and new claims, not because the legal outcome was uncertain, but because the public appetite for motive never goes away. In June of 2021, Inside Edition reported on letters Watts wrote to a woman who corresponded with him. In those reports, he allegedly described planning the murders for weeks and described giving Shanann oxycodone in an attempt to end the pregnancy because he believed it would make it easier for him to be with his girlfriend. He also allegedly claimed he attempted to smother the children in their beds before the night of the murders, but failed. Those claims did not change the sentence. They did not reopen the case in court, but they deepened the public understanding of intent, because planning and drugging are not the language of impulse. They are the language of preparation. This is the point where the Watts story becomes difficult in a different way, because it forces a choice about how to hold information that comes from a convicted killer after the fact. A killer can tell the truth and still be manipulating. A killer can exaggerate. A killer can minimize. A killer can shift blame. A killer can claim planning to sound powerful, or claim chaos to sound less responsible. The only stable ground is what can be corroborated, what is supported by documents, what fits the physical record, what fits the timeline investigators already established. But even when the public treats later claims carefully, the psychological weight remains. The idea of planning turns the crime from an eruption into a path. The idea of drugging a pregnant woman to end a pregnancy turns the crime into a sequence that begins before the night of the murders. The idea of an earlier failed attempt to smother the children turns the crime into repetition. And repetition is one of the most disturbing forms of intent, because it means there were multiple moments when the outcome could have changed and did not. This is why the case stays present years later. It is not only the brutality of what happened. It is the speed with which the lie collapsed, followed by the slow release of documents that showed exactly how the collapse happened. It is the way a plea deal created finality without public trial details, followed by record releases that filled the space a trial would normally occupy. It is the way recorded life and recorded investigation allowed people to watch the story unfold again and again, as if watching could reveal a warning sign that would make the world feel safer. But the Watts case does not offer a comforting warning sign. It offers a modern reality. It shows how quickly a disappearance becomes a homicide when routine breaks and a friend refuses to wait. It shows how fast a timeline narrows when cameras exist and phones record movement and messages. It shows how a double life creates motive, and how motive becomes pressure, and how pressure produces lies. It shows how lies change shape when they are forced into specifics. It shows how confession can arrive mixed with blame shifting. It shows how evidence does not care about the story a suspect wants to tell. And it shows how a case can end in court and still keep unfolding in public memory, because the people who loved the victims are not living in a timeline of documents, interviews, and documentaries. They are living in a timeline where the calendar keeps moving, but the family does not. In the public mind, the calendar kept moving, but the case kept pulling people backward, because the recordings preserved the exact moment when a lie still had room to breathe. On the evening of August 14th, Christopher Watts sat inside the Frederick Police Department with FBI Special Agent Grom Coder. The timestamp at the start of the recording marked the interview as a formal step in a missing persons investigation, but the tone was already shifting. This was not a casual conversation. It was a structured effort to lock a story to minutes, objects, and decisions. Coder explained that investigators would ask the same questions repeatedly, not to annoy him, but to map his memory against the world. He explained that people misremember when they are stressed, and he said small details matter because small details can be verified. Then he asked Watts to write down his entire timeline, from the start, with times if possible. But Watts agreed, and that agreement mattered. A person can improvise when he talks. A person has less freedom when he writes. Written statements become an anchor. They become a reference point that can be compared to video, phone data, workplace logs, and witness accounts. A liar does not fear questions as much as he fears specificity. While he wrote, the room became quiet. He joked about being back in school, and he asked how much detail he should include. He started building a clean, ordinary story, a story built to sound like routine. He wrote about Shanann coming home from a trip. He wrote about waking early. He wrote about a conversation in the bedroom. He wrote about leaving for work. He wrote about backing his truck into the driveway to load tools. He wrote about believing Shanann would take the kids somewhere later. He wrote about not knowing where they went. The problem was that the house was not cooperating with the idea of a clean departure. The phone was found in the home. The purse was in the home. Medication was in the home. The car was in the garage with the children's car seats still inside. Shoes and personal items were still present. The front door had been latched from inside earlier, so it could not open fully. All of that created an environment where the phrase she left started to sound less like an explanation and more like a defense. The neighbor's camera added pressure that no conversation could remove. The surveillance fixed a time window in the early morning. It captured him backing his truck into the driveway. It captured the truck leaving. It did not capture Shanann walking out later with 2 children. The absence of that moment became a silent fact that kept growing louder. By the morning of August 15th, the investigation had moved from checking possibilities to testing credibility. Watts agreed to a polygraph. He had already told investigators he did not know where his family was. He had already been adamant that there was no infidelity in his marriage. He chose to keep the story simple because simple stories are easier to repeat. But that morning, Anadarko's security manager contacted investigators and reported that workplace records suggested Watts had been communicating with a contract employee, Nichol Kessinger. The point was not gossip. The point was that he had denied an affair, and a record existed that suggested he was lying about it. Once a person lies about one major fact, investigators assume he may lie about other major facts, including the fact that matters most. During the polygraph, the question centered on whether he had knowledge or involvement in the disappearance. The report of the examination described deception indicated. The polygraph result did not prove guilt by itself, but it changed the pressure in the room. It forced a decision. Keep the original story and let the investigation destroy it piece by piece, or offer a new story that sounds less damning. After speaking privately with his father, Watts shifted his narrative and confessed to killing Shanann. He also offered a blame-shifting version, claiming Shanann harmed the children and he reacted. He then provided the location of the bodies at an Anadarko oil site known as Survey 319 and marked the locations on an aerial photograph. That single step moved the case from uncertainty to verification. Investigators went to the site and used a drone during the afternoon. They reported seeing a bedsheet in the field near the tank battery and fresh disturbed earth consistent with a grave. Those observations mattered because they were not dependent on his story. They were independent signs that something had been placed and hidden there. That night, he was arrested, and the missing persons case became a homicide case with a named suspect, a known disposal site, and a confession that could be compared against physical evidence. The legal outcome arrived quickly because the evidence did not leave him much room to fight in public. He pleaded guilty in early November and was sentenced in late November to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years tied to the pregnancy termination and tampering charges. In early December, he was transferred out of Colorado to a maximum security facility in Wisconsin due to safety concerns. A courtroom ending should have meant a closed file, but the Watts case stayed alive because a plea deal closes the legal argument while leaving much of the narrative unresolved in public. A trial forces evidence into the open through testimony and cross-examination. A plea does not. A plea creates finality without a full public accounting, and that absence becomes a space the public tries to fill. That is one reason investigators returned to him in February of 2019, after the sentence was already permanent. They went to document a more complete account, to address inconsistencies, and to understand how he described his own path. The follow-up interview took place at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, in a room staff called the computer room, lined with empty cubicles. In that interview, Watts described prison as easier than the county jail because he could move without constant threats. He described receiving letters from strangers, some condemning him, some trying to connect with him. The investigators made it clear they were not reopening the case. They said they wanted to understand what happened. Then they moved into what he had tried to hide early, the affair and the systems of secrecy around it. He described communicating with Kessinger on his work phone because he believed Shanann checked his personal phone. He described using a hidden calculator-style application to store photos and messages. He described deleting his Facebook account because he feared that Kessinger's friends might look him up and discover his family. Those are small actions on their own. Together they describe deliberate concealment, and deliberate concealment is a mindset. It trains a person to lie as a daily habit. He described the period in July when Shanann and the girls were in North Carolina. He said he stayed at Kessinger's home most nights during that month. He described going home after work to exercise and eat, then leaving again to spend the night elsewhere. He described the feeling of being able to forget his role as husband and father because the family was physically out of state. That detail matters because it shows how absence can reduce emotional friction. When responsibilities are not in front of you, they are easier to treat as negotiable. He also described conflict within the affair. He described moments when Shanann called repeatedly, when she demanded to know where he was, and when he tried to cover his movements. He described moments when Kessinger felt insecure and feared she would always be second. This is the reality behind the fantasy. A double life is unstable, and instability increases pressure. Pressure increases lying. Lying increases isolation. Isolation increases the chance a person will choose the most extreme form of escape. In the prison interview, he described trying to stage the home after the murders in a way that would create a different story. He described removing Shanann's wedding ring and placing it on a counter so it would look like she had decided to end the marriage. He described discarding a therapy book to suggest that nothing could fix the relationship. He described leaving items in places where they would be found. These are not random actions. They are narrative actions. They are attempts to make murder look like departure. He also described the welfare check performance. He described arriving while police and Shanann's friend were already there. He described entering through the garage, then opening the front door for officers. He described going upstairs and pretending to look for Shanann and the children. That detail is one of the clearest explanations of why the case remains so disturbing. It shows how quickly a person can switch between private truth and public performance, even while law enforcement is standing in the same house. He described getting rid of bedding after the murders because he believed it contained evidence. He described thinking about what investigators would notice, what objects would suggest what story, what would make a disappearance look plausible. That is consciousness of guilt expressed through logistics. He also spoke about his decision to plead guilty. He described not wanting the case to drag on for years. He described not wanting a courtroom fight that would force families to listen to every detail repeatedly. That explanation can sound humane on its surface, but it also functions as another form of narrative control. A plea ends the story on his terms. It prevents a full public trial. It limits testimony. It limits cross-examination. It closes the file quickly, and it leaves many details locked inside investigative records rather than spoken aloud in court. What the follow-up interview did, more than anything, was show the structure of his thinking in hindsight. It showed that the affair was not a separate side story. It was part of the motive framework the official record already summarized as resentment and infidelity. It showed that secrecy was not a one-time choice. It was a routine. It showed that staging was not an afterthought. It was an attempt to create an alternate reality for anyone who entered the home. It also showed why the investigation moved as quickly as it did. His performance did not exist in a vacuum. It collided with a friend who acted immediately. It collided with a home that held too many essential items left behind. It collided with a neighbor's surveillance that anchored the morning. It collided with workplace records that contradicted his denials. It collided with a polygraph that shifted the pressure. And once he gave up the location, it collided with physical signs at the site that could be seen and documented. This is the brutal logic of modern investigations. A suspect can control his words, but he cannot easily control video that already exists, records that already exist, witnesses who already notice patterns, and physical scenes that already contain traces. In the Watts case, the lie collapsed quickly because the world became specific faster than he could adapt. And yet, even with a permanent sentence, the public appetite for explanation did not stop, because the public did not witness a full trial. The plea deal left a gap between what was legally known and what was psychologically understood. The follow-up interview filled some of that gap by showing how he described his own secrecy and staging. It did not provide closure. It provided clarity about intent, and clarity can sometimes feel worse than uncertainty, because intent removes comforting stories. Intent removes the idea that it was an accident. Intent removes the idea that it was one moment that spun out of control. Intent replaces those ideas with a sequence of choices, and a sequence of choices is harder to accept. That is where the case sits in the American true crime landscape now. It is not only remembered as a family annihilation, it is remembered as a recorded collapse of a narrative, a case where the audience watched a man plead for a family he already knew was gone, then watched the investigation pull the truth out of him in days, then watched the legal system close the door permanently, and then watched the records continue to reveal how much of his behavior was shaped by secrecy, staging, and the desire to start over without consequences. And when a case is remembered that way, it does not fade, because it becomes more than a crime. It becomes a demonstration of how normal language can be used as cover, and how quickly that cover burns away when evidence forces the story to match reality.